All right, let's just dive right into this explainer and unpack the hidden mechanics that might be draining your wallet without you even realizing it. Today, we're taking a pretty fascinating look at the calculated science of what our source material boldly describes as legally scamming you. We're going to break down exactly why your grocery bill keeps climbing while the actual amount of food you bring home seems to be magically disappearing. To set the stage here, I want you to picture a scenario. Say you're a young professional, right? Maybe 25 years old, working super long hours, maybe dealing with some credit card debt. You decide to treat yourself and buy a pack of potato chips for the first time in a while. Now, you notice it's a bit more expensive than you remember, but whatever, you brush it off. Then you open the bag and bam, 3/4 of the container is literally just air. The source describes this exact feeling brilliantly. It's how the realization hits you right in your bones when you look down at those 10 sad little potato slices. You feel legally scammed, and honestly, it naturally makes you see red. So we've got to ask ourselves, is this shrinking grocery haul just a company trying to survive a really tough inflationary economy? Or is there a highly calculated scientific strategy lurking at the bottom of that bag? So, I want you to lock this number into your brain right now. 13%. Because this isn't just some random statistic. It actually acts as a psychological magic trick, and it's being used against consumers every single day in the aisles of your local supermarket. As we go through this, we're going to see exactly how this specific number unlocks billions of dollars for giant corporations. Section 1. The case of missing chips. To really understand what's happening here, we have to look closely at the practice of shrinkflation. Keeping the price exactly the same while quietly lowering the quantity of the goods. And it's not just happening in the snack aisle. Take a standard small box of Kleenex, for example. Pre-2022, you were getting 65 tissues in that box. But by 2022, that number quietly dropped to 60. Now, 5 tissues might not sound like a huge deal to you or me, but for a massive company selling hundreds of millions of units globally, stripping away just 5 tissues per box translates to absolutely massive cost savings. And look, this isn't some brand new trend they just dreamed up last year. If we look at a household staple like Charmin toilet paper, the historical data is genuinely shocking. Since the 1960s, a standard roll of Charmin has lost over 65% of its total sheets. And it gets worse. The physical size of each individual sheet has actually shrunk by 20%. The product has literally been evaporating over the decades, piece by piece, millimeter by millimeter. Section 2. The science of shrinking. So, how do they actually get away with this without everyone rioting? Well, the answer lies in a concept known as the just noticeable difference, which is rooted in something called Weber's law. Discovered by a scientist named Ernst Heinrich Weber, this psychological rule proves that humans are quite literally blind to gradual, calculated reductions. The law basically states that a physical change in an object's weight or size has to reach a very specific percentage threshold before the human brain even physically registers that a change has happened. Until you cross that threshold, your brain just assumes the object is exactly the same as it was before. It's wild. Which brings us right back to our magic number. For small objects, like a bag of snacks or Doritos, that just noticeable difference threshold sits at right around 13%. If a manufacturer keeps the weight reduction precisely under that 13% limit, your brain simply doesn't register the missing potato chips when you pick up the bag. You literally don't feel the difference in your hand. This psychological blind spot is relentlessly exploited, turning missing chips into billions of dollars in pure, totally unnoticed corporate profit. Section 3. Greedflation and quality collapse. Now, if you turn on the financial news, you're going to hear corporations citing severe supply chain issues or claiming they're in survival mode as the main reason your grocery bill is spiking. But the actual data tells a starkly different story. In 2024, producer input costs, meaning what it actually costs the company to make the product, rose by merely 1%. Yet, the prices passed on to us, the consumers, were hiked up by 3.4%. There's this massive, jarring disconnect between the survival narrative they're pushing and the cold, hard numbers. The source analysis doesn't pull any punches here. They refer to this aggressive margin padding as greedflation. The argument is that these companies are using a genuine, albeit very small, 1% increase in input costs as a mere veneer of legitimacy. They essentially use that 1% as a convenient excuse to jack up prices by 3.4%, capturing that extra 2.4% not to survive a tough economy, but purely for margin padding and, as the source perfectly quotes, shareholder smiles. If you want to see the sheer scale of this, just look at the underlying drivers of inflation. During parts of 2023, data reveals that corporate profits accounted for a staggering 53% of inflation. I mean, let that sink in for a second. More than half of the inflationary pressure consumers were feeling wasn't from rising wages or supply chains breaking down. It was directly slowing right into corporate profit margins.
But wait, the extraction doesn't stop at the price tag or the weight of the box. We've also got to talk about the mechanism behind why your favorite childhood products seem to objectively taste cheaper now. This is a sneaky tactic called skimpflation. This happens when manufacturers don't just shrink the package, but they secretly downgrade the quality of the actual ingredients inside it over time just to save a buck. A perfect historical example of skimpflation is Coca-Cola's recipe shift back in the 1980s. To save massive amounts of money, they didn't just swap their ingredients overnight, because obviously people would notice the taste difference immediately. Instead, they executed this incredibly slow, calculated 4-year transition. In year 1, they were using raw sugar. Over years 2 and 3, they gradually blended in cheaper ingredients. By year 4, high fructose corn syrup was fully adopted. By dragging it out over years, they masked the quality collapse. They completely transformed the product while banking on the hope that the consumer's taste buds wouldn't register the slow degradation. Section 4, Fighting the Profit Squeeze. So, zooming out for a second, the source material argues that these corporate tactics, shrinkflation, skimpflation, greedflation, they're really just macro symptoms of a much larger issue. The core argument here is that this kind of behavior is deeply rooted in the continuous erosion of our fiat currency. They specifically point to the timeline since the US dollar was fully detached from physical commodities, like the gold standard, in 1971. As the purchasing power of the currency itself erodes, corporations become hyper-focused on monetary extraction rather than providing real, tangible value to you, the consumer. There is some good news here, though. We are finally starting to see some real, organized global pushback as awareness grows. Governments are actually waking out to the just noticeable difference trick. South Korea, for instance, is now issuing fines to companies for unannounced shrinking of products. And Australia is currently proposing mandatory labeling, which would literally force companies to clearly state right on the packaging when a product's size or weight has been reduced. But honestly, even with government intervention, the source makes a crucial point. Your absolute best weapon against all of this is your own wallet and your own awareness. Why? Because the one thing corporations fear way more than short-term profit loss is permanent damage to their brand value. When consumers recognize the 13% illusion, when we realize the ingredients have been skimped on, and we actively say, no, that is not a fair price increase, companies are forced to either correct course or risk destroying the trust they spent decades building. Which brings us to our final thought for this explainer. As you look at your own grocery cart this week, and you go to pick up your favorite snacks, ask yourself, are you truly getting what you paid for, or are you unknowingly financing the gap between the just noticeable difference and a shareholder's smile? Next time you shop, I challenge you to look just a little bit closer and see if you can spot that 13% illusion before you tap your card. Thanks for joining me on this explainer. Stay sharp out there and keep learning.